The concept behind the verification letter is that the doctor is supposed to have had an established relationship with the tenant and then sign off on a letter. And unfortunately, there are companies out there that pay doctors to use their license to sign off on these letters, and essentially both the company and the doctor make money quickly and easily without ever having to visit with or actually diagnose a patient. It's completely unethical, and very few of these companies, or should I say doctors, are challenged on what they're doing. And many landlords are afraid to challenge these letters in general for fear of getting a fair housing lawsuit thrown at them. These companies have found what they think is a loophole, and now unassuming or non confrontational landlords who prefer not to have pets in their properties feel forced to comply. Welcome to your Landlord Resource Podcast. Many moons ago, when I started as a landlord, I was as green as it gets. I may have had my real estate license, but I lacked confidence and the hands-on experience needed when it came to dealing with tenants, leases, maintenance, and bookkeeping. After many failed attempts, fast forward to today, Kevin and I have doubled our doors and created an organized, professionally operated rental property business. Want to go from overwhelmed to confident? If you're an ambitious landlord or maybe one in the making, join us as we provide strategies and teach actionable steps to help you reach your goals and the lifestyle you desire, all while building a streamlined and profitable rental property business. This is your Landlord Resource Podcast. Hey there, landlords. Thanks so much for tuning in today. This is Stacy, and I'm here with Kevin, and we're kind of excited. So we're going to start something new here where around once a month or so, we're going to be doing a podcast talking about fair housing. And we've realized there's so much to say, and there's a lot of misinformation that we think that we can shed some light on. Some will be regular length shows, and some might be a little shorter depending on the subject matter. But today we're going to start by discussing service animals, but more importantly, support animals and where they land within fair housing and the HUD guidelines.
So a few months ago, we had an episode where we interviewed Logan Miller of Our Pet Policy. They're a third-party pet screening company that essentially keeps track of the pets, ESAs, and service animals you allow your tenants to have in your units. And they do all of the background checks and verifications when a tenant or applicant states they have a need for an emotional support animal. That episode was a good one with a lot of great information, so much so that we felt it was necessary to do a follow-up show on some of the stuff we weren't able to cover in the first one.
Yeah, we actually had an opportunity to have lunch with Logan a few weeks after we had recorded that episode, and he really opened our eyes to all the things that most landlords are not aware of. So that's kind of what we're going to go over today. And I'll start with the fact that quote unquote service animals are not only for physical assistance, like when you see someone in a wheelchair or a visually impaired person with a service dog that leads them around. These animals can also be trained for medical emergencies to assist people with diabetes or seizures, heart disease, and many other very serious medical conditions. And there's no doubt about the need and use of these highly trained and certified animals. But for the show today, we are going to try to focus more on emotional support animals, or ESAs, which are used for mental health needs. These animals do not require training or certifications or registration for their use. The definition of an ESA with regards to having them in a rental property is summed up in the following. They are to alleviate one or more symptoms of a person's disability. They are not trained for a specific purpose or for a specific task. Tenants with disabilities may request a reasonable accommodation from leases with no pet provisions, and a wide variety of animals can be ESAs, including cats, ponies, ferrets, and even snakes.
Yes, you heard that right. It's not just the usual cat and dog. It can be ponies, ferrets, snakes, fish, or most any animal, really. But don't worry though, most states have size restrictions for certain rental properties. Now, these animals are protected under U.S. fair housing, which is enforced by HUD, which means landlords cannot discriminate against those with disabilities, be it emotional or physical. And I think it's important to note here that where U.S. fair housing covers the U.S. as a whole, many cities and counties and states have their own stricter laws that protect tenants with ESAs. For example, New York has the New York Human Rights Law that states service animals are not just dogs, they can be cats, birds, or miniature horses. And as Stacy mentioned earlier, types of service animals can be guide dogs for the blind, hearing dogs, even psychiatric, like for mental health. So these service animals are trained to do such tasks as guiding visually impaired persons and making sure they cross the street without being harmed, or pick up a fork if it's dropped from a wheelchair, stuff like that. When I was growing up, my sister was in the 4-H club, and one of her projects involved guide dogs. Now, the dogs themselves were from Guide Dogs for the Blind in San Rafael, California, just north of us here in the San Francisco Bay Area. The puppy would stay with us for about a year, and my sister would do all the basic training. I mean, that dog was with her almost 24/7. After that, the dog went back to San Rafael and was paired with a blind person and would go through very intense training. If the dog passed the training, they were matched up permanently. The first dog passed with flying colors. The second time, the dog did not pass the training, but the good news was we were given first choice to get the dog back, and of course we said yes, and that dog was part of our family for many years. Service animals can also help during seizures, or for some people with certain medical conditions, these animals are trained to know how to apply pressure to the chest or abdomen to control blood flow and stimulate someone and wake them up after a seizure occurs. They are also trained to activate an alert bracelet, bring someone their phone, or go and get help.
I know, that's pretty cool. So our niece has epilepsy, and where she's on meds and has been seizure free, thank goodness, for many years now, the first time she had one around me, it was really scary.
Yeah, I remember that. We were in church, and I can't remember if it was Christmas or Easter. And this is a girl that lives a very normal life, but every once in a while she'll have a seizure, and it really just brings things into perspective. I mean, that even just relatively normal, healthy looking people can have very serious illnesses. Of course, she doesn't have a service animal, but she definitely would qualify for one if she was still experiencing these seizures. And again, I'm discussing actual service animals here, not therapy dogs, which are also known as ESAs. Like we said before, the difference between therapy and service animals is that therapy animals are not trained to do specific tasks. Emotional support animals, aka ESAs, aka therapy animals, are used to create dopamine and serotonin and help people with anxiety or depression cope better. They are also used to lift people's spirits, so you'll often see them in hospitals or nursing and retirement homes. All of our kids have told us that when they were in college, the schools would bring in these dogs and even sometimes puppies for students to play with and help ease their stress during finals, and they said it actually made a difference. Okay, so again today, we will be discussing emotional support animals because those seem to be the ones that are questioned the most. Not a lot of landlords are going to question the need for a blind tenant who needs guidance or a tenant in a wheelchair that needs assistance, nor if the tenant has a serious health issue that only the dog can assist with when they're alone together.
Absolutely agreed. And I think what most landlords have trouble with is understanding the need to have an animal to help with emotional issues. So we have one complex where pets are not allowed at all, and we'll often get accommodation requests from applicants for an ESA. But in our other complex, I think we allow pets. Or are all those animals service animals?
They were all existing when we purchased the place, so I'm not 100% sure if they are just pets or ESA, but regardless, 3 of the 4 units have animals in them. I guess I should go back and look in our files to see if they're ESAs or just pets.
Yeah, might be a good idea. But I know the one with the cat is an ESA, but I believe the older gentleman downstairs, his little dog's a pet. Anyway, doesn't matter. And I tell you, you guys, it's hard. We really do not prefer tenants have pets or any animals in our units. And we love animals and we understand how people want them around. We just prefer that they not own them when living in our units. Because the smell and the damage, not to mention the fur from cats and dogs, means you're going to be replacing the carpet regardless of how long that tenant's been in the unit. Because if the next person who comes in has allergies, you're going to have to deal with it anyway. And I don't care how trained a pet is, when they have to go and no one is there to take them out, they're going to potty on your floors. And that is a nightmare to deal with afterwards. But please don't get me wrong. As much as I love pets, I also do not think that large dogs or large animals in general belong in apartments. I think they need a yard and they need some room to move around. And that's just my 2 cents. Take it or leave it. So let's discuss what landlords do have control over when it comes to ESAs and support animals. One common mistake that landlords will make is to assume that all animals, service, or therapy are okay if the tenant claims they need them. Landlords, listen to me on this. You are allowed to ask for verification. You can ask if they have any documentation to show the need for that service or therapy animal.
Yeah, so there's a couple of ways this can be processed. That tenant or applicant should provide a letter that comes from their doctor, psychiatrist, a social worker, therapist, or basically any mental health professional. This letter must state that 1, the tenant has been under the provider's care, 2, he or she meets the definition of disability, and 3, due to that disability, he or she needs a certain animal to alleviate disability-related difficulties, to live independently, and to enjoy that housing. You can also verify that this letter is authentic, and we will discuss how to do that in a minute. Landlords should also have the tenant sign an addendum in the lease and gives you as much information as possible about the emotional support animals. For instance, you can ask for proof that the dog has been vaccinated and that it's been licensed in the county. You should have a photo of the animal in their tenant file along with its name, weight, breed, etc. Now, let me tell you what landlords cannot do. Landlords cannot ask the tenant for medical records or any confidential healthcare info. Landlords also cannot restrict the size or specific breed of an ESA. They can only restrict if there is a health or safety threat to others, like if the dog shows aggression to others, or to the property, which is something that would happen after the fact. So if the dog growls or nips at others, barks nonstop, which violates their right to peaceful enjoyment, or chews up the carpet or moldings, that would be a reason to ask the tenant to either remove the animal or move out. However, this threat has to be something that cannot be eliminated or reduced. So, like if they kept the animal in a cage so it cannot roam free and damage the property, or get out of the unit unattended. You also cannot charge an additional security deposit or rent for ESAs. Because they are considered assistive and because tenants are allowed reasonable accommodations, you cannot require or charge additional fees or quote unquote impose additional financial burdens specifically for ESAs. If you do, that is seen as discrimination in the eyes of HUD and the Fair Housing Act because you're not allowing them equal housing opportunities.
Right. So let's switch gears here a little and talk about the ESA letters themselves. I think that it is definitely worth mentioning that a good portion of ESA verification letters are not valid. But how can you tell if the letter you received from your tenant is real or fake? So, if you're not aware, there are companies online that sell verification letters. Some are authentic, but many of them are not. And sometimes it's really hard to tell the difference. So, let's back up a minute and explain what the qualifications are for having an ESA. So, to qualify for an assistance animal, a person must have an official letter from a registered healthcare provider. The letter has to confirm that the person requires a support animal or a service dog. And so far, only 2 states have notable laws regarding ESA verification letters that go only with the federal law. So, for the state of California, this letter must state that the tenant is under the care of a licensed health professional, has been under their care for at least 30 days, and has been seen by this healthcare professional within the last 30 days. For the state of Wisconsin, their law mirrors that of HUD's Fair Housing Act, but goes a little further and limits who can actually provide that letter. That professional must be licensed in Wisconsin and acting within the scope of his or her license. And the reason that they say that is so that someone can't go online and select a doctor who practices out of, say, North Dakota to write an ESA letter for a tenant that's living in Texas. It also means that the doctor they see must either be their primary doctor, a licensed therapist, psychiatrist, or a social worker. They cannot get a letter from their dermatologist or their eye doctor. And this specification from Wisconsin is important, and you'll see why in a moment. Many other states do have laws that pretty much mirror those of HUD and fair housing, but they might also have variations like those other 2 states that make a difference for your specific rental property. So you need to make sure you learn the state and local laws where your rental property is located. We found a great site and it lists all of the ESA laws for each state. So we're going to link that in the show notes so you can check it out.
Okay, so what are some of the conditions that would warrant the need for an ESA? The reason could be for conditions such as depression, panic attacks, phobias, autism, ADHD, or physical disabilities. This letter gives tenants certain rights that other pet owners don't have. The right to keep an animal, even if the landlord is like us and has a no pet policy. It also allows them to keep the ESA without an increase in rent or security deposit, as is common for tenants with pets. So the validity of these letters is often questionable. And where some might say they didn't know their letter was fake, I kind of question that. If you are that emotionally ill that you're having panic attacks and need an animal to help calm you down, chances are you're under the care of a psychiatrist or therapist. At the very least, a primary care doctor. Now, I understand that some people do not have a doctor or cannot afford a therapist. I really do. But then I question how that person can afford to own a pet because that can be expensive as well. Having an ESA letter means that the tenant's animal is used for therapeutic purposes. If someone knows they have a mental disorder, I would certainly hope they would be under the care of a licensed health professional to obtain that diagnosis and not just say something like, I have PTSD. So I tend to question when I hear tenants say they didn't know their letter was fake. You guys, there are a ton of companies online that will provide an ESA verification letter for a fee. They are signed off by a licensed professional, but that professional has never even seen or talked to that tenant to verify any information. Some doctors that have signed these online letters have been found to have medical licenses, but not be in a specialty that would be able to diagnose a mental illness. Like I mentioned before, dermatologists, eye doctors, surgeons, radiologists, etc., all technically are licensed medical professionals. And they certainly would not be someone who would be diagnosing depression or ADHD. Additionally, that doctor may or may not be licensed in the state where the tenant resides, too, which I get with online medical these days, and you can do video appointments, but it's our understanding that doctors are not able to work across state lines.
Right. So when our son was in college during COVID, his doctor would do video appointments, and his doctor would have to know if he was actually in the state of California or not, because if not, if he was away at college in South Carolina, the doctor was not able to diagnose or prescribe medications. So most doctors are only licensed in one state, maybe two if they've moved or something, but usually their malpractice insurance only covers them in the state where they practice. And here's where the fraud comes into play. Online, there are sites that will issue ESA letters within 12 to 48 hours. You go on and Google ESA letters and look at all the sites that come up. There's no way that this letter can be created legally in that short period of time. And I'm going to use caution here because I know there are many people with a need. However, when tenants want a pet and they live in a unit with a no pet policy, all they have to do is say that the animal is not a pet and it's used for a disability. They go online and pay for one of those letters stating their need, and boom, they are legally allowed to house that pet, now known as an ESA. And even if pets are allowed by the landlord, they get to have that pet without having to pay an additional rent or increased security deposit. It's a total loophole in the system that so far, it seems only California and Wisconsin have made efforts to combat this issue around legitimate ESA letters. And some of these online places are for real, so I'm not saying all online letters are fake. So here's what happens. Someone either wants a pet in a no pet unit or, they actually have an emotional need to have an ESA. If it's the latter, they have a therapist, psychiatrist, or primary care physician who can attest to the mental or emotional health issue and can sign a letter to say that they feel an ESA is needed. Some people have expressed to us that the ESA was actually the idea from the doctor, not them asking about if the doctor felt an ESA would benefit them. So there's that to consider as well. But online, the person goes on already knowing that they need a letter so that they can have a quote unquote ESA. The tenant goes on and fills out a questionnaire saying that they're depressed, submit payment, and either by the end of the day or the next day, they're emailed their letter. And you guys, these letters are not cheap. The average cost is $100 or $200 when they're purchased online. And that is a letter that should be free if they are seeing this doctor on a regular basis. The tenant does not have to list their personal doctor's name on the questionnaire for the online company to verify the need. They simply fill out a questionnaire, and then a licensed healthcare provider will read it over and then issue their letter to them electronically. It completely skirts around the entire point of verifying the need for ESAs, and tenants know all they have to do is pay the fee and they can't be charged a pet rent or additional security deposit, which is total bullshit. 9 times out of 10, that online doctor has never even spoken to the patient, which is against the law. The concept behind the verification letter is that the doctor is supposed to have had an established relationship with the tenant and then sign off on a letter. And unfortunately, there are companies out there that pay doctors to use their license to sign off on these letters, and essentially both the company and the doctor make money quickly and easily without ever having to visit with or actually diagnose a patient. It's completely unethical, and very few of these companies, or should I say doctors, are challenged on what they're doing. And many landlords are afraid to challenge these letters for fear of getting a fair housing lawsuit thrown at them. These companies have found what they think is a loophole, and now unassuming or non-confrontational landlords who prefer not to have pets in their properties feel forced to comply.
Let's help you guys with learning how to spot one of these fake ESA letters. If you go online and check the site where the letter came from and you see that it gives instant approvals, that's your first red flag. If the letter includes an ESA registration number, that is also a sign it's fake because, as we said earlier, there are not any registrations or certifications for ESAs. If the letter does not contain healthcare provider information, it's not a valid letter. There must be contact information or a license number on the letter. Now listen to the next statement. You are allowed to verify the letter as part of the screening process. You can check the healthcare provider's license in your state's professional licensing database. So, as we mentioned at the beginning of this episode, about 6 months ago, we did a podcast where we interviewed Logan Miller of Our Pet Policy to discuss this issue. And it's quite an eye-opening episode, and you should check it out. We'll link it in the show notes for you. So, a couple things you can do to help yourself with this verification is to use a third-party verification service so that you can ensure that you did not violate any HIPAA or fair housing laws. Now, we don't want to be a Debbie Downer here, but there are services that will not really go that extra mile for you to verify the validity of your tenant's ESA letter. What they do is they only verify that the licensed health professional is actually licensed, and that's pretty much it. They do not speak to them personally and ask about the tenant's need, how long they've been working with the patient professionally, and if they have plans to continue working with them. We highly recommend you check out our pet policy. I believe they offer our listeners a special low price when they enroll with their pet monitoring service. And they really have a great customer service department to walk you through what to do if a tenant wants to get an ESA. They also do all the background checks on the verification letters, and they actually speak to the doctor about their relationship with the patient. And here's the kicker. When they find a doctor who is just signing letters and has no relationship with the patient, they issue a cease and desist letter and put them on their national list of doctors that they have found that do this instant ESA letter and are in ethical violation of their medical license. We'll link our pet policy in the show notes so that you can check them out. And you might be saying, oh, why use that company when there are other larger companies that can do it faster for me? Okay, here's why we think our pet policy is better. And you may think we only push companies because we're paid to, but let's really be clear here. We will not represent a company that we do not or would not use and pay for ourselves. And our pet policy is no exception here. They're a quality company who are landlords themselves and have the interest of the landlord in mind. They do thorough ESA letter screening. And there are other very large, very well-known pet screening companies that do not do this. And they charge a bundle to do these verifications, like $60 a pop.
Yeah, so a lot of large apartment complex management companies use these screening services to do their verifications, and they charge their owners buco bucks as an added fee to verify ESAs on their behalf. And many owners of multifamily properties use those large, popular, our name says it all company as well and pay that $60 fee. And I'm telling you, all they do is check to see if the doctor is licensed in their state and if the letter has all the necessary information required. There is no screening going on at all. It's a total racket and completely unethical in our opinion. You can also hire your attorney to do this work for you, but I'm not so sure how cost effective that would be if there are agencies out there that can do the work at a fraction of what your lawyer costs. If you want to do the screening yourself, you certainly can. The bottom line is the ESA letter that your tenant gets must meet the specific criteria that is outlined by HUD. So let's start with what the letter should include. Specifically, an ESA letter must include the following. It must be on the doctor's official letterhead with the state in which they're licensed to practice and the date their license was issued. It needs to include the patient's name, your tenant's name, and diagnosis with an eligible emotional or mental disability, and the type of emotional support animal, and clearly state how that ESA can help the individual and the specific symptoms or effects of the disability that the animal is intended to alleviate. The letter could state the mental or emotional health condition that substantially limits one or more major life activities that is aided by the presence of an emotional support animal. However, it does not have to specify what condition the tenant has. The letter should also have the date that the letter was issued, because ESA letters are valid generally only for 1 year. So having the date on them is really important. And I'm going to sideline here and say that when that letter is expired, you should be contacting your tenant and asking them for an updated letter. Some letters may also mention a specific animal. For example, if you're dealing with an applicant who already owns that pet and that pet's going to become their ESA, or if the licensed healthcare professional recommends a specific type of animal that's needed to help alleviate their mental health issue. And ESA letters can also cover multiple ESAs if the condition requires the attention of 2 or more animals. And in that case, the letter should mention each animal. And the last requirement is that ESA letters must have an original or a digital signature from a licensed healthcare provider to ensure their authenticity. It is your right as a landlord to actually verify the legitimacy of that letter. And it's much like screening a tenant and checking their credit and their income, past landlord experiences before placing them in your unit. You can go online to your state's medical licensing board to confirm the doctor's license is valid. And if so, you're entitled to contact the doctor and discuss with them how long they and the tenant have had a doctor patient relationship and when their last appointment was. You might even be able to ask how many times they have met to determine if this is something they have been doing for a while or if it's a one and done appointment. You can ask when and how the relationship between the doctor and patient began. And you absolutely can ask if the tenant contacted that doctor for the sole purpose of obtaining an ESA letter. You can inquire about the pet and ask how the pet is supposed to assist with their emotional needs. And this can be especially important if the doctor says the tenant or the patient needs more than one ESA.
Yeah, so if that incoming tenant has more than one ESA, each ESA needs to be able to provide a need. And the doctor has to be able to explain why the tenant needs more than one ESA. These are all questions that third party companies like our pet policy can find out for you. And if you feel the information you've received during this conversation with the doctor is unreliable, you can deny the reasonable accommodation, but we do advise that you use caution. Until you've done this a few times and have a really good feel for if it's fraud or not, maybe run the information you found by your legal team or maybe contact a pet screening company and pay them to see if they can find the same results. Okay, there are some exceptions to ESA accommodations where you, as the landlord, can deny someone an ESA, and they are if you live in an owner occupied unit or if you live in a multifamily property with up to 4 units, you can deny an ESA. And here's a big one. If you own a single family home rental, I believe that's up to 3 single family home rentals, and you self manage, meaning you do not use a broker or a licensed property manager to manage your properties, you are exempt from having to accept an ESA. This is because you are making an independent decision about the rental process and have more control over your property. For this next one, there must be concrete evidence, but if there is a health or a safety risk to others, you can ask a tenant to remove the ESA. Now, remember, this rule only applies if there's actual proof of the animal's bad behavior. So, like there needs to be a report of an animal attacking someone or another animal for this one to fly. You cannot base this decision on stereotypes about an animal's breed or size. The last reason for denying an ESA is that it has or is likely to cause significant damage to your rental. So if you have an apartment building with no outside space and your tenant wants a mini horse, you might have grounds to deny that request. And a side note here, in order to know if an ESA is damaging your unit, you must do periodic inspections to check for damage and violation. We have a tenant in one unit with an ESA, and when we went in there for the first inspection, the tenant wasn't home, but we were pleasantly surprised to see that the dog was in a large open crate so that it was not wandering freely throughout the unit when the tenant wasn't home. This made us consider whether we would require this if future tenants wanted an ESA. Not sure we can, but definitely something to look into.
Yeah, and I have a couple more things that I'd like to note. In your lease, make sure that it says the tenant must contact you before getting an ESA. And the same thing goes if you're going to allow pets. You need to make sure that your lease states that the pet or the ESA has to be approved by you before they bring it home. If they just bring that animal home and then call and say, here's my letter, that's a big no-no. You have the right to verify that ESA, and I believe you have 10 days to do so before allowing that animal onto the property. They should be completing a reasonable accommodation request form before and start the process that way. So this form, the reasonable accommodation request, is a similar concept to when they sign your application to rent. It contains information and also authorizes for you to be able to verify the need for that ESA with their physician who has signed that ESA letter. If they do not sign the authorization, you cannot legally speak to anyone regarding their need for an ESA to complete your end of the verification process. However, if they refuse to sign an authorization, denial of that ESA is warranted and supported by HUD and the FHA. You can also provide a form with questions for their doctor or therapist to complete in lieu of them providing a letter, but this is not a must, and you can't deny the request for an ESA if the doctor refuses to complete that form and instead uses their own form letter. It would be more of a perk or an added benefit if they completed it, and completion would usually be in place of you speaking with them in person. And we get it, real doctors and therapists are busy, and they're not going to go out of their way to speak with you about their patient and verify the letter. And because many landlords are not persistent enough, most letters, especially those illegal online ones, don't get verified. And the fake companies know this and bank on the fact that the letter provided will be enough.
Okay, so we have had a few questions come our way about ESA verifications. Someone asked, what if my insurance has limits on pet size or breed and will cancel my policy? HUD has addressed this, and basically, your insurance is in violation of fair housing laws by canceling your insurance for a legally allowed animal in the rental property. But still, this happens, and it's not your job to fight the insurance company. I mean, unless you want to. It may be easier or best for you to change policies or insurance companies. If you cannot find a company to insure your property with said animal, you would have to be able to prove that no insurance company will cover you.
Yeah, and you guys, in this case, this would be your hardship. So, noted as an exception that we spoke about earlier. And another question that came up was, how do I handle an existing tenant with a severe pet dander allergy or a fear of the animal? Who gets priority, the existing tenant or the new resident? So the reality is that you can't tell someone that they can't have an ESA because the neighbor is afraid or severely allergic. Basically, you have to do the best that you can. You have to make an effort to work with both of them to reach a compromise and a solution. So, for instance, in a multifamily or a rent by room situation, you'd have to have them agree that they're not going to be in the hallway or the elevator or on the patio at the same time. And I'll tell you, more than likely, you're going to lose one of those tenants in the long run. Okay, so hopefully this episode was able to clear up a few things about ESAs today. Bottom line, ESAs and service animals are not pets. These animals provide a lot of comfort and care for many people, and we do need to respect that there is a need there, even if that need screws with our no pet policy. Just know that, as with placing tenants, you have the right to verify the validity of that ESA, and if you choose not to, you got nowhere to complain. So that is our show for today. And thank you for sharing your time with us. We are very humbled that you find our content useful. And one new thing that we have is a link at the beginning of our show notes where you can now text us a message. So if you'd like to ask a question or tell us how great we are, you can do so by clicking that link. It goes to our podcast software, so be patient. It might take a day or two for us to respond. And actually, we're going to be doing a Q&A episode, and we would love to answer your questions. So we're going to link our emails in the show notes. You can send your question over, and we'll do our best to fit it in. But if you want to use that new text option, you can certainly send your question in that way as well. You guys, if you love this podcast, you might also love knowing that we're working on an online course that's going to walk you through the steps of placing your ideal tenant. It's called From Marketing to Move In, and it's going to cover how best to market your unit with photos and the writing of your ad. Kevin's going to do a little thing in there about all the photography and how to do that, showing the unit, accepting applications, and how to vet your applicant. And we're also going to teach you about your lease and what it should contain and what to do before and when your tenant moves into the unit. So if you have struggled with finding the right tenant to pay rent on time or take care of your unit, this course is for you. You can sign up to get on our wait list and potentially be part of our first beta group by using the link in our show notes. And as always, we would love to stay in contact with you other than on the podcast. We have a free weekly newsletter. We have a bunch of free forms and documents you can download that we have created just for you. We have a private Facebook group. And of course, we have all of our social media sites, which we're going to link in the show notes for you to check out. So thanks again for listening today. And until next time, you've got this, landlords.